The first time I saw the number, my brain did not believe it. $500 per night. That was the fine the association was prepared to hit us with if we did not shut down our Christmas lights display, starting on a specific date circled in red at the bottom of the notice. Not a one-time fee, not a small slap on the wrist. A nightly penalty, like a meter running in the dark every time a bulb on our roof dared to glow. This was supposed to be a season of cinnamon candles and quiet evenings, but instead I found myself at my kitchen table, hands shaking over a glossy violation letter, living through what felt like my own HOA revenge story. The paper smelled faintly of toner and cheap perfume, as if someone had taken extra satisfaction in printing it. The wording was stiff, but the meaning was simple: comply or pay. It promised a countdown that would hurt. It promised that if we did not dim our joy, the board would make sure our bank account did instead. The worst part was not even the money. It was the fact that the threat was coming from someone who lived just 3 houses away, a woman who liked to walk the cul-de-sac with a clipboard tucked under one arm, taking notes on everyone else's lives. She was the one who signed the letter in a firm, looping script, right under the printed title of president. By the time I reached the last line, I understood the stakes. This was not about one strand of lights being too bright or a timer being set too late. This was about control. About whether the HOA Grinch at the top of our little pyramid could dictate how much joy our street was allowed to show the world. And as I stared at that fine schedule, something in me shifted. I did not know exactly how the story would end yet, but I knew one thing. If the board wanted a showdown over a display that brought half the town to our sleepy cul-de-sac, they were going to get one. I just had to survive the opening moves long enough to hit back. Outside the kitchen window, the early December sky was already turning the color of wet concrete, and I could hear the soft hum of our lights as they started their nightly cycle, a gentle whisper against the cold air. To understand how we ended up with a $500 nightly threat, you have to understand our street, and the strange little kingdom that governed it. Our cul-de-sac was one of those places that seemed ripped from a real estate brochure. Neatly trimmed lawns, matching mailboxes, and a row of maple trees that turned a perfect blaze of red and gold in the fall. The kind of place where delivery drivers slowed down because the curve of the road looked like a holiday card even in April. When my family moved into the house at the end of the circle, we were given a welcome packet that felt less like a greeting and more like homework. Inside was a 3-ring binder titled Community Standards Handbook, Rev 2021, along with a smaller leaflet labeled Seasonal Decoration Guidelines. Those guidelines were my first introduction to the way our homeowners association thought about joy: strictly regulated, tightly timed, and always subject to approval. According to the seasonal decoration guidelines, holiday displays could go up no earlier than November 25th and had to come down by January 5th. Lights could be on only between 6 p.m. and 10 p.m. Inflatables could not exceed 6 feet in height. Animated or musical displays required prior written approval from the board. And everything, from wreaths to window candles, had to be in keeping with the aesthetic harmony of Evergreen Point. Evergreen Point. That was the name of our community and our association, the words stamped across every newsletter and every invoice. It sounded peaceful, almost cozy. But inside those neatly formatted pages was a quiet kind of control that, at first, I thought was harmless. For the first few years, we played along. We kept our porch lights simple. A wreath on the door, some icicle lights along the gutter, a couple of lit deer near the maple in the front yard. We met our neighbors, brought cookies to doorsteps, waved at the president when she walked by in her quilted vest with her clipboard. Her name was Caroline, but in my head I started thinking of her as the HOA Grinch long before the Christmas that changed everything. She had a way of looking at things that made you feel measured. Her gaze would glide up and down your house like she was running a mental checklist. Were the trash cans hidden? Was the lawn evenly cut? Were the blinds all the same color from the street? She could make a stray leaf feel like a misdemeanor. The first official sign of trouble came in the form of an email blast on November 1st that year. It was an evidence prop we all skimmed and some people ignored, but I kept the printed copy tucked in the binder like a warning. The subject line was Seasonal Decoration Reminder, and inside it, the board reissued the same guidelines we had seen before, with one noticeable addition. This time, there was a sentence referencing Section 7.4 of the Community Standards Handbook. Holiday illumination, it said, must not be excessive or disruptive to neighboring properties. Any display that drew unusual traffic or created a nuisance could be subject to immediate enforcement action, up to and including daily fines. Most of the neighbors shrugged it off. The year before, our cul-de-sac had become the unofficial light show of the subdivision. Each house had tried to outdo the next, and the board had not said a word. Cars lined the circle, kids pressed their faces against fogged-up windows, and the only complaints were about running out of hot cocoa. That year, though, things were different for my family. It had been a rough 12 months. Work stress, personal losses, a quiet heaviness that seemed to settle over our living room after dinner. I wanted something that cut through that heaviness, something that felt outrageous and bright and unapologetically joyful. So, we decided to go all in. Our display was not just a string of lights this time. It was an entire show. We invested in synchronized light controllers, tuned to a rotating playlist of instrumental holiday music that neighbors could listen to on a low-volume outdoor speaker. We wrapped every tree on our property, outlined the roof, built a glowing archway over the driveway. In the center of the yard, we set up an 8-foot-tall artificial tree covered in warm white lights that shimmered like falling snow. We even added a subtle charity element, a small, weatherproof donation box near the sidewalk with a sign encouraging guests to drop spare change for the local shelter. It was simple, tasteful, and in my mind, completely in the spirit of the season. When we flipped the switch for the first time on the Friday after Thanksgiving, the entire cul-de-sac seemed to inhale at once. The sky was a cold, deep blue, and I could smell wood smoke from someone's fireplace as the lights surged to life in coordinated waves across our roofline. Within days, the traffic started. Not chaos, just a slow, steady stream of cars crawling past with headlights dimmed. Kids pointed from back seats. Couples in coats walked the circle hand in hand. Our neighbors brought out lawn chairs and blankets, turning the show into an excuse to be outside together in the chilly air. Most of them loved it. One person did not. I noticed the first real sign of Caroline's displeasure during that first weekend, before any formal notice showed up. She walked the circle slower than usual, her clipboard pressed against her chest, eyes narrowed at the glow reflecting across the asphalt. The lights from our yard painted her in alternating gold and white, like she was being interrogated. She did not stop to chat. She just paused at the edge of our driveway, studied the display for a long moment, and then wrote something down with a sharp, decisive movement. The scratching of her pen sounded louder than the music drifting from our speaker. On Monday, the first letter arrived. This one came in a plain white envelope, slid into our mailbox like junk mail. Inside was a violation notice, dated December 4th. It referenced Section 7.4, B excessive illumination and cited increased traffic and potential nuisance as reasons for concern. It stated that our display appeared larger and more complex than what the board had previously informally permitted in the cul-de-sac. There was a short deadline. We were instructed to reduce the intensity and size of the display within 7 days or face a $50 fine. The letter attached a photocopied excerpt from the seasonal decoration guidelines and underlined the phrase in keeping with the aesthetic harmony of Evergreen Point. On its own, that letter could have been a simple warning, the kind of thing that stings but then fades. What made it different was the tone, and the timing, and the fact that none of the other houses, some of which had sizable displays of their own, received anything similar. I knew, because we asked, quietly, during evening walks when the cold air made our breath puff like steam. Our neighbor across the circle had a 12-foot inflatable snowman. Another house had a projector casting swirling snowflakes up the entire face of their garage. Yet somehow, the only house with a violation notice dated December 4th was ours. I tried, at first, to be reasonable. We adjusted the timer so the lights shut off at 9:30 instead of 10. We lowered the speaker volume until you could barely hear the music unless you were on the sidewalk in front of the house. We dimmed a few of the brighter elements and turned off a set of strobes we had barely used. For a few days, it seemed like that might be enough. The traffic kept coming, but it was calm, orderly, almost reverent. People drove slowly, never blocking driveways. Some of the neighbors even started putting out thermoses of coffee and small trays of cookies for visitors. The whole thing felt like a small-town festival packed into the curve of our street. And yet, I kept seeing that clipboard. Caroline started walking at odd hours, often alone, sometimes with the treasurer trailing behind her. He always looked like he would rather be watching a game somewhere else, hands shoved deep in his jacket pockets, but he followed her pace. They would stop near our yard, whisper, and then move on. The abuse of power was subtle at first, like a draft you only notice when you sit too close to a window. In the background of all this, my stress built. The holiday lights that were supposed to make the season easier now buzzed in my brain as a constant question. How far would they push this? How much could they really do? It did not help that Evergreen Point had a reputation in nearby neighborhoods. People joked about our rigid rules and the way our association handled even small disputes with formal letters and fines. I had heard stories from other streets, little Karen neighbor drama sagas about people being written up for leaving a hose coiled in the wrong spot or painting a front door a shade too bold. I had always thought those stories were exaggerated. Now, watching the president stand at the edge of my lawn with her clipboard in the glow of our lights, I was not so sure. The second letter was the one that changed the tone from annoying to genuinely threatening. It arrived exactly 1 week after the first, right on the deadline stated in the initial notice. This time, the envelope was marked with bold red text at the top, "Final warning." Inside, the wording was colder. The date at the top was December 11th, and it referenced not only Section 7.4b, but also a newly highlighted line in the handbook, the board's authority to assess daily fines for continued noncompliance after a specified correction period. They attached another evidence prop, an excerpt from the Community Standards Handbook, this time from Section 10.3, which dealt with enforcement and fines. Under that section, someone had circled a clause in dark ink: the association may levy continuing fines for ongoing violations, not to exceed $500 per day, until the violation is cured. The letter laid it out clearly. The board believed that our display, in its current form, violated both the spirit and the letter of the seasonal decoration guidelines. They claimed that the increased traffic posed an unspecified risk. They noted that they had received complaints from unnamed residents about noise and congestion. And then came the line that made my stomach drop. If the display was not substantially reduced or removed by December 14th at 5 p.m., the board would begin assessing fines of $500 per night for each night the display remained active. We suddenly had 3 days to decide whether we were willing to risk thousands of dollars just to keep our house glowing in a season that had already taken so much from us. The board was daring us to test how far their power reached, and the clock was ticking toward that first $500 night. I remember standing in the driveway that evening, looking up at the lights as they washed our house in warm white. The air was cold enough that the tips of my fingers ached, and I could hear the distant rumble of a car approaching the circle, headlights cutting through the dark. Our donation box by the sidewalk gleamed faintly, already half full of coins and crumpled bills. This was never supposed to be a fight. It was supposed to be a simple display, a way to pull our family and our neighbors into something brighter than the year we had just survived. Now it felt like the association had turned that brightness into a weapon, something they could use to prove that they ran everything, even the amount of cheer on a quiet suburban street. I did not know, in that moment, exactly how we would respond. I only knew 2 things: taking everything down would feel like losing more than lights, and letting them steamroll us without a peep would just invite more abuse later. As the next car slowed in front of our yard and someone dropped a folded bill into the donation box, the glow from the lights reflected off the windshield, turning the whole scene almost unreal. The hum of the display filled the silence between my thoughts, a soft, insistent reminder that the showdown had already begun, whether I felt ready or not. Somewhere behind those lights, behind the rules and the fines and the clipped phrases in the handbook, a line had been crossed. The only question now was how far we were willing to go to push back. When the board gave us that December 14th deadline, it felt less like a guideline and more like a dare. 3 days. That was all the time we had to decide whether we were going to dim our own joy or let the fines start racking up. Every time I passed the kitchen counter and saw that final warning, dated December 11th, my eye went straight to the circled clause about $500 per day. The ink looked darker than it should have, like the pen had pressed hard enough to almost rip the page. For a day or two, my brain just spun. I did the math over and over. One weekend of resistance could cost $1,500. A full week could climb into numbers that made my stomach twist. This was not a small slap on the wrist, it was the kind of penalty you felt in January when the credit card bill dropped like a stone into your inbox. Meanwhile, the display kept doing what it was designed to do. People drove by in a slow, steady procession. They rolled down their windows, breathed little clouds into the night, and watched the lights shimmer across our roofline and trees. The donation box by the sidewalk grew heavier each evening. Sometimes, when the wind shifted, I could hear coins clinking against each other as people slid money through the slot. The more the cul-de-sac glowed, the more obvious it became that this was about something bigger than bulbs and timers. It was about whether one person with a title and a clipboard could decide that joy had become a nuisance. As the deadline crept closer, the tension settled over the street like a low gray cloud. The air was crisp and sharp, and every time a car door shut or an engine idled, it sounded louder than it should in the cold. Neighbors started pulling me aside in quiet, awkward moments. Someone would wander over with a mug of something warm, comment on the lights, and then lower their voice. They wanted to know what the board had said. Whether the rumors were true. Whether we were really facing $500 a night just to keep the display on. I never shared all the details, but I did not lie either. I admitted there had been a warning. I admitted the board was unhappy about the traffic. What I did not admit out loud was how much it bothered me that the complaints were anonymous. The letter talked about residents in the plural, but nobody could name a single person who said they were being blocked in, kept awake, or harmed in any way. One neighbor down the circle, a guy who had lived there almost 10 years, mentioned that this was not the first time Evergreen Point had felt like an HOA nightmare. He talked about a summer when the board went after someone for building a small front yard garden bed a few inches beyond an invisible line. He mentioned an elderly resident who had been written up for leaving their trash can at the curb a few hours past pickup when they were out of town. Those stories had always floated around as background noise, the kind of thing you shrugged at and forgot. Now they felt like part of a pattern. The night before the deadline, I stood at the edge of the driveway and tried to see our house the way the board might. The lights were bright, yes, but they were warm, not harsh. The music was soft, barely carrying beyond the first row of houses. The cars came and went without chaos. The street remained passable. Kids laughed, but they were not screaming. There were no blocked fire lanes, no blaring speakers, no vendors, no mess. It looked, to me, like what any reasonable person would call a festive street in December. Still, the letter was real. The underlying rule was real. That circled line in section 10.3 of the handbook was real, and the words, continuing fines, did not care about good intentions. By the time December 14th rolled around, the inside of my head felt as crowded as the cul-de-sac. I sat at the table with a notepad, writing columns of numbers and options. Turn everything off, 0 fines, but a loss that would echo every time I passed the darkened window. Scale it back dramatically, maybe the board would decide we had substantially reduced the display, maybe not. Stand firm and leave it all on, maximum risk, maximum satisfaction, maximum chance of becoming an example in the next newsletter. In the end, we chose something in the middle. We decided to keep the main show running, but shorten the hours and simplify a few elements. We turned off the strobes entirely and cut one of the more intense sequences from the playlist. We removed a few extra props that were arguably over the top. But we did not shut it down. At 5:02 p.m. on December 14th, the sky already inky and the cold gnawing at my ears, the lights surged on again. For a breathless moment, nothing happened except the familiar waves of brightness flowing across the house. The maple trees shimmered. The archway over the driveway glowed. The artificial tree in the yard sparkled like a captured constellation. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement near the corner. Caroline stood by the mailboxes, wearing a dark coat and that same clipboard pressed tight against her side. The treasurer hovered a few steps back, hands deep in his pockets, breath puffing visibly in the cold. The glow from our yard reached them in soft pulses, making their shadows stretch and shrink across the pavement. She did not walk over. She did not wave. She simply watched the display, watched the trickle of cars, and then started writing. The next morning, a new envelope appeared on our front door, tucked behind the wreath like an unwanted ornament. This one was labeled Final Notice, Holiday Illumination Enforcement, and was dated December 14th, as if someone had driven straight home after watching our house light up and opened a fresh document template. Inside, the tone had shifted yet again. The letter stated that, in the board's judgment, we had failed to comply with prior requests to cure the violation under Section 7.4b. It claimed that the display continued to draw significant non-resident traffic and posed ongoing concerns for safety and harmony. The word harmony appeared so many times in that paragraph that it almost lost meaning. The key part, though, was the second page. There, attached like a bill, was an intent to levy continuing fine form. It referenced Section 10.3 of the Community Standards Handbook and listed a fine schedule, $500 per day, beginning the night of December 14th, continuing until the violation is remedied or further action is taken by the board. No end date. No cap. Just an open-ended meter. The form claimed that the board had the right to assess these fines and add them to our account. At the bottom, someone had scribbled a note about a future option to pursue additional remedies, including liens, if necessary. They did not explain how that would work, and I knew enough not to assume the worst without details, but the implication was clear. They were willing to threaten the roof over our heads over a seasonal display that would vanish on its own in 3 weeks. That was the morning I pulled the binder back out and started reading like my life depended on it. The Community Standards Handbook, which had always felt like dry background noise, suddenly became my late-night thriller. I flipped through sections on architectural approvals, landscaping, parking, and enforcement. Section 10.3, which the board loved to cite, outlined fines, yes, but also something else, a required sequence of notice and opportunity to be heard. There were lines in that section about the association needing to provide a clear chance for an owner to attend a hearing before continuing fines were levied. There were paragraphs about documenting complaints and applying rules evenly across similarly situated homeowners. There was even a sentence about proportionate enforcement, which suggested that violations should be addressed in a way that fit their impact. None of that language appeared in the letters we had received. No hearing date had been offered. No specific complaints were listed by time or name. No explanation was given as to why our house, and not the others with big displays, had become the target. The deeper I read, the more I realized how much of this was about power and how little was about actual harm. The association had rules, but it also had responsibilities. It was supposed to protect property values and community standards, not turn holiday cheer into a weapon. Of course, while I was reading, the fines were supposedly ticking. A few days later, we received our first account statement. It was a single sheet, printed in the same template as our regular assessment invoices, but with one glaring difference. Under the line for our monthly dues, a new line stared back at me. Holiday illumination fine, $500 x 3 nights, $1,500. That was the moment the stakes stopped being theoretical. In 3 nights, the board had claimed the right to bill us $1,500, with more to come if we kept the lights on. If we did nothing, that new balance threatened to grow into something that could swallow our savings whole and hang over our home like a storm cloud. Meanwhile, the street itself was changing. Some neighbors grew cautious, worried about drawing attention. A few dimmed their own lights, not because anyone had asked them to, but because they did not want to become the next target. Others did the opposite. One house added more lights in quiet solidarity, wrapping their porch columns and lining their roof. Another set out a hand-painted sign near the sidewalk thanking visitors for donating to the shelter. People who barely knew us before started dropping cards in our mailbox, small notes of support written in careful handwriting. They talked about how the display made them feel during a hard year. They mentioned how excited their kids were every evening when the lights came on. If the board was hoping to isolate us, it was not working. Instead, they were pulling the whole cul-de-sac into the drama. The turning point came when someone in the neighborhood posted about the situation on a local community app. They kept names out of it, but the story was obvious enough: a board cracking down on a holiday display, fining a family hundreds of dollars per night, while visitors left donations for charity outside their yard. The comments rolled in fast. Some sided with the concept of rules, pointing out that associations existed for a reason. Others were furious on our behalf, calling the whole thing heavy-handed. Strangers asked if there was a way to donate directly to the shelter. The board, of course, did not respond publicly. They preferred their letters and their binders and their quiet meetings in the small clubhouse near the entrance. So I decided to bring the fight to their own turf. The next board meeting was scheduled for mid-December, just a few days after the fines started appearing on our account. The agenda, which the association emailed out to all residents, included a single vague line under new business, seasonal decoration enforcement. That line became another evidence prop in my mind, a small digital receipt of the conflict we were now fully part of. The night of the meeting, the clubhouse smelled faintly of burnt coffee and dry carpet cleaner. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, a thin, constant buzz that felt like it was drilling straight into my temples. Folding chairs were lined up in rows facing a plastic table at the front, where the boards sat with their nameplates and stacks of paper. Caroline sat in the center, flanked by the treasurer and the secretary. She looked composed, pen poised, agenda printed in front of her. Her expression did not change as residents filtered in and took their seats, coats rustling, boots squeaking softly on the tile. I had come prepared. Under my arm, I carried a folder filled with printed pages. Copies of the violation notices, the final warning, the intent to levy continuing fine, the account statement showing the $1,500 line. I also had a printout of Section 10.3, with the parts about hearings and proportional enforcement highlighted in bright yellow. Alongside that, I carried something else, a one-page summary of the donations collected so far, with a simple total at the bottom. When the meeting reached the seasonal decoration enforcement item, the room seemed to tighten. Caroline began by framing the situation in abstract terms. There had been concerns, she said. Increased traffic. Safety issues. A need to maintain harmony. She did not mention our names, but everyone knew. The glow from our cul-de-sac was practically a character in the story. When the floor opened for owner comments, I stood up. I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse anyone of being heartless. I simply laid out the facts, the dates of the letters, the lack of any offered hearing, the way Section 10.3 promised an opportunity to be heard before continuing fines. I pointed out that our neighbors had not received similar letters, despite substantial displays of their own. I mentioned the donations, the orderly traffic, the lack of any actual documented incident. I held up the account statement with the $1,500 fine and let the number hang in the air. I talked about how it felt to see that sum appear overnight for something that would be gone in 3 weeks anyway. I saw a few people in the audience shift in their chairs. One or two nodded. The treasurer kept looking down at his papers, jaw tight. Caroline listened with that same measured expression she always wore when she walked the cul-de-sac. When I finished, she thanked me for my comments in a neutral tone and said the board would review the matter in light of the governing documents. In other words, nothing was changing yet. But as I sat back down, one thought settled in like a weight: if the board insisted on playing strictly by the book, then the book could cut both ways. If they wanted to turn our lights into a financial weapon, I was going to find a way to turn their enforcement into something that cost them much more than money. The meeting ended without resolution. The fines, according to the account statement, still stood. The deadline still loomed over every evening at 5 p.m. when the lights flickered on. The only thing that had changed was me. The moment I walked out of that fluorescent hum into the cold night, with the sky clear and sharp above the dark silhouettes of the trees, I knew I was done just reacting. I started planning. By this point, we had received multiple violation notices, watched the board lean on Section 10.3 to justify $500 nightly fines, and seen a $1,500 line appear on our account for 3 nights of lights. The cul-de-sac had split between nerves and support, the community app buzzed with opinions, and the board had dug in behind their binders while I stood up at their meeting with highlighted rules and a list of donations in hand. The association thought they were winning because they had the power to print invoices. What they did not realize was that every new piece of paper they generated was another prop in a story that was slowly turning against them. The idea for the charity event came from a single line in one of the rules I had almost skimmed past. Buried in the seasonal decoration guidelines, under a paragraph about special events, was a small section about temporary community gatherings. It mentioned that the board could approve short-term events that might generate extra traffic as long as proper notice was given and the event served a community purpose. The examples listed were things like neighborhood yard sales and block parties. What stuck with me was the phrase community purpose. Our lights had already drawn people together. The donation box had already turned casual visitors into contributors. The only thing missing was a formal label, something that would make it hard for the board to pretend this was just one family being difficult. So, late one night, with the soft hum of the display seeping through the walls and the faint scent of cold air leaking in around the door, I opened my laptop and started drafting an email. I addressed it to the board as a whole and copied the generic community address. I kept the tone polite, almost painfully so. I explained that, in light of the concerns about ongoing traffic and fines, we planned to adjust our approach. Instead of keeping the full display running nightly through the end of the season, we would shift to a single, designated final night event. On that night, I wrote, we intended to host a one-evening charity display, with all donations from visitors going directly to the local shelter we had already been supporting. We would coordinate with the shelter to have someone present to accept donations, and we would encourage guests to park responsibly and keep noise to a minimum. Most importantly, I referenced the very section of the guidelines that talked about special events and community purpose. I formally requested the board's acknowledgement that this one-night charity event fit within that framework. I did not demand anything. I did not threaten legal action. I simply laid the request at their feet, framed in their own language. Then I sent a separate email to the shelter. I explained the situation in broader terms, focusing on the opportunity rather than the drama. I told them our street drew a steady stream of visitors, that we wanted to turn that attention into tangible support. I asked if they would be willing to send a representative, maybe bring a small sign or literature, to help people understand what their money would do. Their reply was warm and grateful. They loved the idea. They offered to share the event details with their supporters too, which planted another small seed in my mind about how many people might show up when the time came. As the plans solidified, I kept reading. In another late-night session, I found yet another evidence prop, a formal policy document attached to an old newsletter, outlining how the board was supposed to handle hearings and notice for fines. CCR Section 10.3 Hearing Procedure, the header called it. It spelled out that, before any continuing fine was imposed, an owner was supposed to receive a written notice with a specific date and time for a hearing. At that hearing, the owner could present their side, and the board had to consider all evidence before voting. Only after that could continuing fines be approved. We had never been given a hearing date. The more I underlined, the more I saw the path forming. The board had overreached. They had tried to jump straight to punishment without following their own process. They had treated the handbook like a one-way tool. If they wanted to lean on their authority, then our one-night charity event was going to showcase, for the whole community, how they were using it. Because once the date for that single, final night was set, and once the shelter and our neighbors and the wider community knew that the association was still threatening $500 nightly fines over a fundraiser, the question would no longer be about whether our lights were too bright. It would be about how bright the spotlight on the board's behavior could get when the entire neighborhood was watching. We put the plan in motion quietly. We marked a Saturday close to Christmas on the calendar and started calling it our finale night. We adjusted the display schedules so that, in the days leading up to it, the show ran shorter and simpler. The fines, according to the board's paperwork, were still in effect, but I was careful to document everything: timers, photos, notes about traffic patterns. We slipped small flyers into mailboxes on the cul-de-sac, inviting neighbors to the one-night charity event. The flyers focused on the shelter, on the chance to close out the season with something meaningful. They did not mention the fines at all. They did not have to. Word traveled fast enough in small circles. At the same time, I sent a follow-up email to the board confirming the date and the nature of the event. I thanked them, preemptively, for recognizing the community value of a charity night. I noted that we would, in respect for the guidelines, keep the event limited to a specific window of time. Their reply was terse and non-committal, but it contained a line that mattered: They acknowledged receipt of our notice and stated that our event would be discussed at the next board meeting. That was enough. It meant they could not claim they had not known. As the chosen night drew closer, the air grew sharper and the sky darker earlier. Each evening when the lights flicked on for their shorter runs, I could feel the tension building under the surface, like the low hum of the transformers hidden in our yard. The cul-de-sac was no longer just festive, it was waiting. We had turned their threat into a countdown for something else entirely, one night where their fines and their power would collide with a street full of people, a donation table, and a charity that did not care about aesthetic harmony, only about whether families had a warm place to sleep. What none of us knew yet was just how many cars would snake their way into our quiet circle that night, or how the look on the HOA president's face would change when she realized the story had slipped out of her hands. In the days leading up to our finale night, the cul-de-sac felt like it was holding its breath. The lights still came on each evening, but their runs were shorter, less elaborate. The timers clicked off earlier, leaving the street dark and quiet while the sky was still dusted with starlight. The donation box by the sidewalk remained, though, and coins still dropped through the slot with a soft clink that sounded louder in the cold. On the surface, it looked like we had backed down. Underneath, everything was shifting. In the evenings, after the display powered down, I sat at the table with my growing stack of papers. I organized everything into a timeline: the first violation notice, the final warning dated December 11th, the intent to levy continuing fine, the account statement with the $1,500 line item for 3 nights, the email about the board agenda with its vague reference to seasonal decoration enforcement. I slipped them into a binder, each document in a clear plastic sleeve, like I was building my own case file. Beside that binder, I kept a new folder. This one held the good stuff: a running total of the donations from our box, a confirmation email from the shelter, a draft copy of a simple, calm statement explaining what our finale night was about. It was all written in neutral language, nothing dramatic. Just facts about the money raised and what it would do. A story had formed between those two stacks. On one side, the fines and threats. On the other, the impact of a display that had brought people together. The board stayed mostly quiet. Their only response to our event notice was a short email acknowledging receipt and stating that our plans were under review. No one told us to cancel. No one approved it either. They just left us in that gray space where they could later claim they had never signed off. But silence cuts both ways. With no explicit denial, our finale night plans moved forward. The shelter confirmed the date and said they would send a small team with a folding table and some informational pamphlets. They were excited, not scared of a homeowners association. Their world dealt with problems a lot bigger than a cul-de-sac full of Christmas lights. On the street, neighbors started asking about the event more openly. People mentioned it while dragging trash cans to the curb, or while standing with their hands jammed into pockets, watching the shorter light runs on weeknights. Someone down the circle offered to set out thermoses of hot chocolate. Another neighbor said they had a portable fire pit they could put in their driveway if the weather cooperated. You could feel the shift. What had started as our family's decoration choice was now bigger, messier, shared. The night before the event, I stayed up later than I meant to, taping a large piece of poster board to a folding easel. I wrote the words carefully in thick, dark marker. At the top, I put the shelter's name, along with a simple, hopeful line about helping families stay warm. Below that, in smaller text, I noted how much had already been raised. Then, at the bottom, I wrote one more sentence. I kept it respectful, factual, impossible to dismiss as rumor. Tonight's display is under a $500 per night fine from the association. No accusations. No insults. Just a hard, sharp fact laid out where everyone could see it. As I stepped back and looked at the sign, I could already picture it in the glow of the lights, with the shelter's folding table beside it and the donation box just beyond. The idea wasn't to start a riot. It was to make sure, when people came to enjoy the show and drop coins into a box, they understood exactly what it was costing us and who was insisting on the bill. On the afternoon of the event, a brittle cold settled over Evergreen Point. The sky was pale and clear, and the bare branches of the trees scratched faint silhouettes against it. When I stepped outside, I could smell wood smoke drifting from someone's chimney, layered over with the faint plastic scent of the extension cords coiled along the side of our house. We set up the shelter's table near the sidewalk, close to the donation box. The volunteers arrived bundled in coats and scarves, lugging a rolling cart filled with brochures and a small locking cash box for larger bills. They smiled easily, grateful for any help, and asked where to stand to stay out of the way of cars. By the time the sun fully disappeared, the first line of headlights had already appeared at the mouth of the cul-de-sac. When the display powered up for the evening, this time at full strength, no shortened sequences or half-lit trees, it felt different. The house glowed like it had on that first night after Thanksgiving, every bulb pulling its weight. The archway over the driveway shimmered. The artificial tree in the yard sent soft, repeating pulses of light through the cold air. The hum of the transformers blended with the low rumble of idling engines. The air smelled like exhaust and cold pine as cars crept along the circle, windows cracked just enough for passengers to hear the music and breathe in the December night. And there, right at the center, stood our sign. At first, people stopped because of the charity angle. They leaned in to read the name of the shelter, nodded when they saw what their donations would support, and dropped bills and coins into the box or handed them directly to the volunteers. Then their eyes dropped to the bottom of the sign. Some people blinked, leaned closer, and read the line again. $500 per night. You could watch the realization spread. A family would approach the table cheerful, ready to give, and then their expressions would shift as they reached the bottom line. Parents exchanged looks over their kids' heads. Teenagers pulled out their phones, tapping away. A few people stepped back, turned, and looked toward the mouth of the cul-de-sac where the clubhouse sat down the road, just out of sight. It did not take long for the board to show up. Caroline appeared first, walking down the sidewalk in a neatly pressed coat and boots that clicked against the concrete. Her clipboard was there, of course, held tight against her side like a shield. The treasurer and secretary followed a few steps behind, their breath visible in the crisp air. They stopped near the edge of our property, close enough to see the sign clearly, but not so close that they had to stand with the shelter volunteers. The lights washed over them in waves, sometimes making their faces glow warm, sometimes leaving them in shadow. For a while, they just watched. Watched the cars inch forward. Watched kids pointing at the lights. Watched people walk up to the table, read the sign, and turn to look at them, faces puzzled or outright irritated. The board members were not used to being on display. All season, they had done their work through quiet letters, binders, and private votes. But on this night, every $500 threat they had printed was hanging in the air over a charity table, and the whole neighborhood could see exactly who had chosen to make joy into a bill. I did not confront them. I did not need to. Instead, I moved through the crowd, answering questions when people asked, sticking to calm, simple facts. I explained that the board believed our lights were a violation of Section 7.4b. I mentioned that they had started fines without offering a hearing as outlined in Section 10.3. I pointed out that we were using this one night to raise as much as we could for the shelter, and that we had notified the board about the event in advance. I kept my tone level, almost gentle. The more neutral I was, the sharper the contrast became between what the board had chosen to do and what the community was choosing to do right in front of them. Phones came out. People snapped photos of the lights, of the shelter's table, of the sign with its calm, brutal sentence. Some filmed slow pans of the line of cars and the board members standing at the edge of it all. No one shouted. No one caused a scene. That would have given the association an easy excuse. Instead, they watched. They documented. They let the image of it all sink in. By the end of the night, the donation box was overflowing. The shelter's cash box was heavy. When we finally counted everything under the kitchen light, fingers still tingling from the cold, the total sat on the page in a neat line of ink that took my breath away. We had raised more for the shelter in one night than any of us expected. More than enough to matter. The next morning, I sent a short email to the board with 2 attachments. One was a scan of the tally sheet showing the donation total. The other was a copy of that CCR Section 10.3 hearing procedure document, annotated with the dates of our notices and the nights the fines had supposedly been running.